Open your cerebral cortex and shift your lobes into upper beta phase, because you are going to have Bitcoin knowledge transmitted directly into your vestibulocochlear. Your host at Bitcoin Knowledge is Trace Mayer, an early Bitcoin advocate since it cost $0.25, but this is not intended to be investment advice. A doctor of jurisprudence, but this is definitely not legal advice. And an investor in core cryptocurrency infrastructure, including RRE, BitPay, Kraken, and Mitagio, but this is not a recommendation of those services. Here, you get fed via direct mind download with pure and free Bitcoin knowledge.
Okay, welcome back to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast. We've got Jim Robinson. He's managing partner at RRE Ventures, one of the premier venture capital funds. So welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad to be here.
You kind of smirked a little bit. Is it not one of the premier ones?
Well, listen, that's just a great lead, and we should go everywhere together, and you can open for me.
Yeah, I can be your introduction. No, but I mean, you've had what, 5 funds of seven funds of 250 million usually, I think, or how large are they?
So all of our funds, except our first one, which was 20 years ago, which was 100 million, all of our funds have been targeted at about 250. Sometimes, our current one is 280. I mean, it varies depending on season, but and what's happening in the market. But typically, in any fund, we invest in 20 or 25 companies, and we're pretty broad, so we do a lot of different things. I mean, as you know, I'm full time and have been for 15 or 18 months on Bitcoin, but we're doing a lot in robotics. We're in the satellite business. We're launching nanosats. So we're a pretty broad organization, a lot of enterprise and internet as well.
These are mainly tech-focused VC funds, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you've had some of the big names out there, like BuzzFeed, right? And like, what are
BuzzFeed, media? The way we divide the world up, because we're based in New York, is 7 industries that are sort of the stovepipes. And people know what they are. They're financial services and media and publishing and advertising and, even things like fashion. And we invest in those sectors that are being transformed. I stay away from the disrupted in the sense that, a lot of those industries actually adapt the technology. So it's transformed by technology. And that's where we invest.
Okay. You mentioned you're now full-time on Bitcoin stuff for like the last 18 months. And I find this very interesting because your father, he had been CEO at American Express, right? And so, I mean, you're one of the vanguard premier VC funds in tech. Why is Bitcoin getting your time and attention?
Sure. Well, it actually goes back 15 years or more. We've always been payment system investors. In the mid-'90s, we spent a lot of time with folks like David Chong at DigiCash and with, Cybercash and the whole ilk of them. In the then era, the problem that we were all trying to solve was micropayments. So if you think about the internet as it began to roll out, the first industries that were really put at risk were media and publishing. There are a couple of roads you could go down. One is the world we live in today, which, 0.5% of those places have a paywall because they can. And
like New York Times or Financial Times,
FT,
Wall Street Journal.
Very small list. And then there's everyone else. So what we were trying to do was unlock essentially, the 402 protocol then of allowing
payment method not specified.
Yeah, payment method not specified. But you couldn't do it because you simply could not use the existing, oligopoly infrastructure, the interchange, to transact at 10 cents, 15 cents, 5 cents, 25 cents, 50 cents, because it costs more to actually do the transaction than the transaction costs.
And they were just not built for the internet, like credit cards, debit cards. I mean, they're an obsolete technology in that sense. Like you're trying to bring a Gutenberg press onto the internet and like no amount of duct tape is going to help it like work with the server, right? We need a native digital or virtual technology to be able to accomplish this, because at the end of the day, we're talking about protocols and the transfer of data or information over this World Wide Web. And so like they just didn't work.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And, always with a new technology and a new protocol, you try to initially sort of glom on the past, metaphor to the present. But in the case of those guys, this was all using elliptic curves. It was all cryptocurrency related. It was sort of the underpinnings of kind of where this thing ultimately evolved. But it was the wrong time. The world wasn't ready. It was the 56K dial-up world. Most people were just beginning to get AOLized, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there was no Facebook.
No,
YouTube didn't exist.
That's right. You had chat rooms and alt groups and, a tiny bit of shopping here and there. And, of course, the .com spooled that up. So our history has been in investing in lots of different things, but lots of payment-related systems as well and processing-related systems. For whatever reasons, I've been focused personally for many years on trying to figure out how to undo what amounts to an oligopoly of just a few names that charge 2 to 250 basis points to everybody that has credit cards. There's no reason why they charge that. The fact is,
well, they can.
Well, they do it because they can. But, the fact is they could do it profitably for 70 or 80 basis points. Mm-hmm. I know this because we sold a company a few years ago that gave them exactly that possibility. They do it because they can. And so I look at Bitcoin and the blockchain as a way to completely reset, not just upset, but reset how we transact.
What Bitcoin companies have you made investments in so far with RRE?
Well, we've made about 9 investments. A couple of them are in stealth. I can talk. I mean, some of them, BitPay is one. I can't talk about the fund structure that we're invested in publicly, but we're in one of the larger, what amounts to indexes in the space. We're a large investor in Chain. We're in Mirror. So there's a long list of them. And we're continuing to invest. We've probably put about $15 million into the space. I'm in the process now of putting another 10 or so in. And really it's at all 5 of the areas, right? So we're somewhat in mining, and then everything north of the mining stack we participate in, whether it's wallets or accounts or
exchanges, merchant processors,
2.0 stuff, people that are focused on the blockchain, smart contracts, etc.
Now, why is the blockchain so fascinating to you? I mean, does it actually solve any pain points for people? Or is this just like fun tech to kind of twiddle our thumbs with?
So I break out the world in developed and developing. That to me is the sort of the central line in terms of use cases. True with digital currency, true with blockchain. In the developed world, there are any number of, I think, important applications around using a public general ledger that's available to everybody at every time, whether it's everything that happens at Wall Street and Reg FD and how we do disclosures today, which is silly and creates enormous cottage industries of accounting and audits. And, it's the climate of the trust-based, or the industry of the trust-based backbone is so expensive. And frankly, we could do away with all of that.
And automate a ton of it.
And automate most all of it, and have a whole lot less. But it's also, where the rubber meets the road with consumers. Think about TransUnion, Experian. I mean, all of these offshoots that create arguably more problems than they solve could go away with a blockchain topology.
Or be radically changed.
Radically transformed.
I mean, because I don't necessarily think we're going to see like just this kind of flipping of the iceberg. I think we're going to see, gradual, incremental, organic change. I mean, do we have a specific example of a pain point that this blockchain technology could solve?
Sure. But by the way, just briefly on your point about the iceberg flip, I agree. It seems like tipping points like that happen, and yet one of the things that I always like to point to when I teach classes is name for me more than 6 brands from the .com era. In other words, the incumbents tend to win more often than not, and that will be true here too. But if we radically change how they do things, just because the brand itself may win, it doesn't mean that the spirit of that organization hasn't been forever altered. Yeah, there are a lot of use cases. I give you a great example of one. So not long ago, I spent about an hour and a half with the state AG of one of our nation's largest states. I probably shouldn't say which one. And it was interesting because, as someone who spends a lot of his time in the public eye, on issues like Airbnb and Uber, just all of these kinds of things, it turns out the single biggest problem that he faces day to day and that his staff faces are inbound calls. Now, this is a large state with a large population, and it's about 300 a week. People saying, I can't find my damn house title, or the bank never sent it to me. I don't have the title.
And he gets 300 calls a week.
300 calls a week minimum.
That's 60 a day.
Yeah, that's exactly.
That's probably like a full-time person just to answer these calls saying,
enormous volume.
we can't find your house mortgage either.
Right. So here's a simple, small scale, yet super important one. whether or not we can sort of, ultimately migrate or create, an identity that's a digital identity for physical assets en masse, we can certainly do it with titles. Certainly titles to things like homes, cars, etc. In that use case, if you just said, okay, let's take these bank titles from these banks in this state and put them into the blockchain, where the assets there, it's the sort of pedigree or the history of the asset, etc., the provenance, then you solve, I don't know, you tell me 90+% of that problem. Yeah, and that's just one small use case in one big state.
Isn't that what we want to accomplish with technology? I mean, when Nikola Tesla envisioned the electrical system, he remembered Goethe's words, "The glow retreats, done is the day of toil." Right. I mean, people didn't necessarily have to be washing clothes and just so much of the manual labor that went into day-to-day life. I mean, why do we have how many people sitting there answering phone calls, like trying to find their mortgages, when it could instantly be looked up? The chain, the quality, all of it could be instantly ascertained. We could know what securities are pledged or hypothecated or where the ownership is. I mean, all of this stuff should be automated, very easy to verify. I was talking with a Federal Reserve Bank bank examiner. She was like, we should be able to automate pretty much all of this examination process, which if we're able to put more and more of these assets onto the blockchain, whether it's houses or cars or airplanes or stocks or bonds or whatever it is, then we can know who owns what, and then we can know how it's encumbered. And then a lot of our verification and confidence and trust, a lot of that can all just be automated.
Well, we don't have to have all the cottage industries, the title insurance and all the validation and verification pieces of that puzzle that we have to have today in order to
and that frees up that human capital to then be working on much more complex problems, like things that are going to be adding more and more value to humanity. I mean, sure. We invent the washing machine. We don't need people. There's a whole cottage industry of people like washing clothes, but now we're able to do it with washing machines, and like humanity's better for that, you could say. I mean, that's what our technology helps us to do.
Well, it's the classic, issue of, okay, what about robotics and, we displace jobs and washing machines are an example of that. Yes, all technologies, although there's never been one that's ever been positive or negative, they're all neutral by definition. It's what we do with them. But advance the ball in terms of making us more productive and more efficient. And there is a displacement period where retraining and education from the beginning has to start in a different direction. It actually generates typically more opportunities than it erases. At least that's been our historical human experience. Perhaps there's a point at which that isn't true, and some people say it's robots and AI, who knows. But in general, these technologies will evolve, and we will have some pain in transitions to jobs and so forth. And take banking. Take retail banking. How many people do you know actually use their retail chain? I don't mean the ATM that's stuck onto the side of it, but actually go in, stand online, and deal with banks. So awful lot of people involved in maintaining, carrying, impeding, supporting, cleaning, securitizing, and working at those things. And yet, the fact is, what is a major bank today? I would argue it's an early version of Dropbox.
That's a very interesting tangent. BitPay recently landed Microsoft as somebody who now, they process the Bitcoin transactions for. And in the press release, Microsoft said, we're dipping our toe into it. We're learning about it, but we've got big plans for Bitcoin. Yeah, are they tipping their hand? Like, what? Why do you bring that up? Like, why are you analogizing a bank to Dropbox? Like, maybe you can help people make the connection. Not all of us went to Harvard Business School,
Right. So to me, if you're JP Morgan or HSBC or Citibank, then today you have several businesses, but one of your main businesses is you're federally and internationally allowed to be a depository institution. You can take deposits and you can store money. Well, it turns out you don't actually store money. You don't walk into a bank and they say, okay, Trace, let me go to, Trace's safe over here on the wall and take out Trace's money. You are already a digit stream. You're probably a digit to them today in most of what you do. And it really doesn't matter what you transact, whether or not it's getting cash from an ATM or taking out a mortgage or, any kind of payment stream, wiring money, et cetera. You're basically a digital file
in their database, in their ledger.
In their ledger, they have digit strings that represent your money. So they're already in some ways Dropbox, if you think about it. Now, they do other things. There's an investment banking arm, and obviously there's, prop trading, and then if you're managing their own money and so forth, asset management. But in that part of the business, in the part that touches most people when they think of these banks, Citibank, Wells Fargo, B of A, whatever, the part that they're thinking about, the consumer part, which is generally the biggest part, other than bricks and mortar, retail locations, ATMs, what are they? I would argue they're Dropbox.
Dropbox for
An
assets.
early incarnation of Dropbox for assets. So in 10 years or 15 years, you can debate the timeline. It's not two. But in a timeline that is something I think like that, they are going to be in the business, if you ask me, of storing digital proxies of assets that are physical. And much like a safe deposit box, which, by the way, isn't where your house title or your car titles are, probably, if you're like most people. Mm-hmm. It may be where they should be, but they aren't, because nobody has them.
Well, you don't know where they are. That's why you're calling the Attorney General's office, right?
Exactly right.
This kind of raises another issue. I had interviewed Perry Ann Boring. She's down there at the Chamber of Digital Commerce. You've been a big supporter of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. They do, a lot of education, lobbying down in D.C. and on the Hill. Why do you think that's important?
So, right, you can make the case that, are you cavorting with the enemy, or, should you be doing this to begin with? Or are you inviting attention? Here's how I look at it. It's the Hippocratic Oath. First, let's make sure that we do no harm with bad legislation. So to me, before people that actually have trigger pull on legislative acts make them, let's try to make sure, if they're going to make them anyway, which in certain cases they are, let's try to make sure they've taken the time to be thoughtful and understand all the different aspects of the argument. If that has the effect of delaying, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, whatever, legislative action, I view that as a win. That gives the ecosystem more time to develop, more time to do its own thing, to do its own self sort of writing work, and prevents bad legislation. So it's not so much about pro-legislation today. Maybe that day comes. I guess with most technologies, as they mature out enough, you end up on the pro side of how do we, do the right things versus the wrong things. But for today, it's in my mind strictly, an educational exercise.
Yeah, because if we go back and look at other technologies like cars, for example, in England, they had passed a law that you had to somebody had to be out in front of the car to keep people, walking in front of the car.
That's right.
You had to walk in front of the car to keep people from getting run over or whatever, and that limited the speed at which the cars could go to 3 or 4 miles per hour.
You find that inefficient, do you?
Not only is it inefficient, but there are unintended consequences, and those consequences played out for decades. Mm-hmm. Why are the major car companies, none of them are UK brands? Probably because they stifled in its very earliest days this new industry, this new technology of the cars. And then along with that, the airplanes, because, if we're going to have combustion engines and we're going to be innovating in this area, if you know how to build cars, well, you put wings on it, and you're going to be transferring a lot of that institutional knowledge and technology into that additional industry. And then airplanes. And would the U.S. really have gotten to space had they, like Britain, stifled their automobile industry, which stifled their aerospace industry, which would have stifled their space industry, which would then lead to, all types of lack of competitive advantage with satellites and, other technologies like that. And so we don't necessarily know all the unintended consequences or the future reality tree that legislation in the present can do to hamper stuff.
Well, just look at the state of the internet today, particularly in the Western world. Let's take America as an example. You've got really only 4 or 5 providers that handle the backbone to something like 75 or 80% of the traffic. That's why we have, highbrow discussions around net neutrality and things like this. But the fact is, we live, again, in an oligopoly there too, where a very few are able to control and affect regulation and legislation around the gateways because it's in their interest to do so, and that's an unintended consequence. It probably costs us, I don't know, you can tell me 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, some real amount of time. Ultimately, the technologies tend to win out, but it can definitely stall and affect for many decades to come the curve.
That's one thing that I think's kind of worrisome for the U.S. is, I know hundreds of people that have now left the U.S. to pursue their Bitcoin businesses in more friendly jurisdictions, whether it's Isle of Man, whether it's London, particularly Vienna, Germany, Singapore, Hong Kong. I mean, these jurisdictions, I know very smart people that are leaving. Like one of my friends, he recently finished a PhD in statistics, and Netflix had offered him like $400,000 a year and working from home. And he turned it down to go to Hong Kong to work on Bitcoin-related businesses. So it's, this brain drain that's happening from the U.S. because we don't really have the regulatory environment that is friendly enough to the industry. We don't know what long-term effects that's going to have on our tech industry, particularly. Is that something you're kind of worried about? Are we going to see other tech industries follow suit and kind of get up and leave?
Well, we had an inflection point with the internet 15, 20 years ago where this very similar issue came up. Today, if you buy a TV, it has a V chip in it. You don't know what that is anymore, but most people don't because they don't have to, because we never really lit it up and we don't really use it. But the reality is there's a chipset in TVs, the chip that is limited at or aimed at controlling content, because we fretted 15, 18 years ago about bad things happening in your living room. And therefore, the government imposed the requirement that a chip go into your TV that can prevent bad things, i.e. the internet, or that part of the internet that they deemed bad from happening. We managed to muddle through that, and we faced, in my view, that same issue today of the blockchain. And will the U.S. regulatory environment stymie development here and drive people to go overseas? It's already happened some. I'm actually not terribly worried about the amount that's happened to date. I think.
Well, because it's just so nascent. Bitcoin's not even a speck on a fly on the elephant's behind right now. It's just so tiny.
But if it stays this way, then I would say two things about it. One is it's a problem for the U.S., and two is, thank God, we've got a global economy today. And so the fact is there are other places they can go. And so it won't stymie as much the development as it might have historically, but it's not good for the U.S.
Not good for it in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Brain drain, national security. There's recently been reignited talk about this Clipper chip 2.0.
Right. Yeah.
One of the reasons we have such a strong national security and cryptography industry in the U.S. is because we didn't let things like the Clipper chip go through. Right. 10 years ago? Right. Do we kind of have any thoughts on that area? If the U.S. loses some of the brain drain in this financial services, in this new creative destruction coming out of blockchain technology, could that have larger ramifications of geopolitical significance?
Well, my guess is the answer is yes. It's easy to sort of spiral into a bunch of use cases where that could be true over time, but it's hard to really know. To me, what you just mentioned, the thing that's most interesting is, when you take at least the enforcement side or the letter agencies, let's call them in the U.S., most that I've talked to actually ultimately like the direction this thing is going. They don't want it to happen tomorrow. They want to slow it down.
Well, I don't think any of us want it to happen tomorrow. That would just be a gigantic bubble that would burst and cause all types of problems. I kind of like the organic growth that we're able to grow in a very sustainable
and at the node, not centralized. They want centralized. So I don't mind that part of the development cycle because I think that it actually is important, to your point, that this be at the nodes, not at the central station, and that it sort of take hold and take root and develop strong roots. And I love the survivability of it. When I say survivability, I don't mean just because of some sort of a nuclear cataclysm. I'm just talking about survivability against any one sovereign, which includes certainly the U.S., but any other of the sovereigns as well.
Yeah, it's. We're seeing big growth of Bitcoin in a lot of these developing markets. Philippines is there's a lot of coins.ph and rebit.ph. You can send Bitcoins now to someone in the Philippines, and it's the physical peso cash is delivered to their house by motorbike within an hour.
One of our startups is actually in that business.
In that space.
And so in the developing world, as opposed to the developed world, the use cases for the currency itself are, and by the way, there actually are, in my view, use cases in the developed world as well. People say, what's the use case? I always say, well, payments is the first app, but first of many. But in the developing world, you don't even have payments. You have 2/3 of the world that really doesn't have access to
they don't even have credit cards.
Infrastructure of any kind. Well, forget credit cards. Most of the world uses debit cards. Most of the world that has cards uses debit cards, which is still about half or less. So it's an enormous opportunity set.
And yet FedEx and UPS still ship to these countries.
They do.
We could really increase U.S. jobs and exports by being able to open up these new markets that we previously couldn't open up because of payments being the bottleneck.
I think that whether it's repatriation of funds, remittances back home, whether it's enabling buyers that couldn't heretofore access markets that now have access, all at low cost, by the way. Very, very little incremental cost for them to both come online and then to utilize the systems. To me, this is where the world gets the most interesting, particularly around payments, is when you light up half the world that doesn't make payments today.
Well, and that's, to close on, that's really what we want to do is light up the world. Just like electricity lighted up the world, just like airplanes have lighted up destinations, just like automobiles and washing machines and the internet and fax machines. All of this is just part of humanity's long journey from the swamps to the stars. And, we're just in kind of the next iteration, the next development of technology in that. And it's really been great having you with us. One of the premier tech funds looking at these new technologies, deciding which ones get funded, which ones don't, which are the good ideas. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us to discuss these things. Is there kind of a closing thought that you'd like to leave with everybody before we wrap it up?
Well, listen, I think this is all fine and well until our robotic overlords arrive, but hopefully they'll accept Bitcoin.
and for any of our Bitcoin entrepreneurs that need to come and beg for money, how did they find you?
Well, easy to find. Jim at RRE. We're actively investing and supporting in the community, and are believers that this is a huge tectonic shift in how people transact around the world.
Wonderful. We've had Jim Robinson, managing partner at RRE Ventures, rrne.com. Thanks for being with us.
Cheers.
Be sure to get a copy of the free Bitcoin Guide at freebitcoinguide.com. Got a question or suggestion? Record your voice at bitcoin.kn. Don't be shy. To help the show, share bitcoin.kn with friends, post about it on Reddit, and otherwise spam the interwebs. Your iTunes comments and 5-star reviews are very important to us. Please continue tuning in to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast, where we release interviews with the top people in the Bitcoin world. Now take some choline and let that Bitcoin knowledge consolidate.